Howdy folks, I'm Caleb Sunstead, your host and normally the game master of Sounds Like Crows, but today we're doing Fireside with Wolfe X. Reggie, how are you today?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Hey man, for people that aren't familiar with you, do you want to tell people kind of a little bit about yourself and where they can find your stuff online?
Yes, so I am a hip-hop artist who writes music that is history-based and literature-based as well. That's important to note. So I have a pretty extensive catalog of music. Majority of it is history from World War II, Civil War, but also I have a couple about literature, like Edgar Allan Poe. I have a whole album about Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh my God.
His poems.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I do.
Dude, that's awesome.
My stuff's on pretty much every streaming service, Spotify, YouTube, iTunes. So yeah, that's where you can...
Man, why do you think no one goes after history for music? It seems like it's kind of an untouched subject, and yet we get, like a million love songs every year.
Well, I think it depends on the genre, because I actually, during most of my 20s, I listened to a lot of heavy metal music. And in heavy metal, it's pretty commonplace, especially with some of the subgenres, like power metal, for instance. They write a lot of stuff about fantasy and history stuff. So yeah, it's not as commonplace or accepted in the hip hop world. In hip hop, it's more stories from the actual life, like the streets and stuff like that. It's really untouched territory, to be honest with you, and that's why it's kind of hard to find an audience right now.
Sure, yeah. Well, hopefully we can help with that, because I think a lot of your sort of knowledge is pretty relevant to our users, or our listeners, rather. Because we started talking about this, just so you have some background. The premise of Deadlands is that in 63, there was this great quake. Some people got very upset at how life was in America, and casted some ritualistic magic. A bunch of terrible shit happened. California sort of cracked open into this terrible maze, and then during Gettysburg, people started to rise up as essentially zombies. Yeah. So essentially, I've gotten a huge history buff onto my show to talk about zombies. That's what I'm going with this. But it was Gettysburg that pivotal for the war? Because the way it's described in the book is that this was the chain of events that set it off for both nations to survive.
Yeah, Gettysburg is often cited as the turning point during the Civil War. Basically, it was the South's attempt to take the war to the North, because most of the fighting up until that point had been in the South, in southern cities, southern towns.
Sure.
And so Lee basically had enough. He was like, okay, we need to take the fight to them. And so they amassed a huge amount of troops and resources, and they decided they're going to go march to the North. I guess it was a gamble, because they didn't quite know what the Union had in store for them, but he was pretty confident in their tactics, and at that time they had a lot more men at that time. And so it was kind of like I don't know, I feel like in a way it was like it's somewhat of a last ditch effort, because they won some, they lost some. It was kind of the split in battles, but at that point I think he knew that they were eventually going to run out of resources, and he was just like, okay, we got to make a push.
Oh, wow.
And so he decided, all right, let's go. And they marched, and it took them through Pennsylvania. I think they were eventually headed towards Washington, towards the capital. I think that was their end goal. And they ran into the Union soldiers who were based in the valley, and it went into history.
That seems like an insane strategy. It seems insane to me to go, hey, we've only fought battles down here. This is where we have all of our supplies. This is where all of our logistics are set up to support our troops. Let's march into their territory and take their capital without having taken a single major strategic point in the North yet.
It does seem interesting. I think a lot of it had to do with also kind of just being tired of fighting battles in their towns and in their cities and their people suffering. And I guess they wanted to bring that to the North in a way, Like,
Yeah.
hey, here,
Eye for an eye.
yeah, it's kind of like that. But I think Lee is considered one of the greatest military minds of all time, and he just knew that they had to make a push or it would not end well.
Do you think the North was aware of that disparity? Like, do you think the North was aware that if they just held the line for long enough, the South would have to concede?
I think the North thought that they would crush the South in months. I really think that they thought they would win the war in months, and then the longer it drew out, and the longer as years went by, I should say, it became clear that this isn't gonna be easy. And yeah, I think the leadership of the North, who it's arguable that they had some inept leadership. They thought that they could crush the South.
Sure, yeah.
And it turned out to be not the case at all.
Dang.
And at Gettysburg, it was basically they met in that town of Gettysburg, which at the time was nothing. It was like it was a farm town.
Yeah.
It was a countryside. It wasn't like you would think it is, these towns, these cities, now they're infamous, but back then no one really cared. It just became famous because of what happened there.
Yeah.
And it's surrounded by all kinds of hills and valleys. There's rock faces, there's wheat fields, and it became a battle on a lot of different areas. Like they had the Devil's Den, which was basically like a bunch of like caves and rock faces. They had the wheat field, which was what it is. It was a wheat field that a lot of soldiers fought in, and it was pretty brutal because the wheat was like as tall as probably a lot of guys stood.
Jesus.
So
yeah.
So you had all that going on, and then the tactics of the Civil War era was to charge head on into enemy fire and hope that enough of your men survived to overtake them. That was the tactics back then.
Yeah.
It was like you're charging into a volley of gunfire, and whoever lives.
Was that just driven by how inaccurate weapons were at the time, or had they just not thought about it further?
Well, that's the interesting thing, too, about the Civil War is that weapons technology throughout the war started to advance. So by the time you get into, like, when they started the war, they're firing basically musket balls, which are pretty inaccurate and subject to all kinds of things like wind and then by the end of the war, you had basically the invention of what we know as modern bullets.
Yeah,
the
shape
of the actual ammunition, and so it changed everything. It made sharpshooters more accurate, and because of that, the death toll only skyrocketed not only because of that, but also medical technology wasn't up to snuff around that time either.
Yeah. You
had a lot of soldiers dying from wounds that nowadays we would almost laugh at, like, oh, you got shot in the I joke sometimes, like the guy got shot in the big toe and then oh, poor guy, he's doomed. And it's like, what? But just nowadays, that wouldn't be fatal, but back then it was fatal.
Yeah, I suppose
because of infections and stuff like that.
They just had zero control over infections, right? Like penicillin didn't get.
Yeah, they didn't have any of that. So,
dude, that's brutal.
But to get back to Gettysburg, it was Robert E. Lee's forces, and I believe it was Buell, for the Union, who he ran into, and the day one, it was basically the South overran the town and the North had to regroup. It was almost like a surprise attack. They didn't know they were coming, or they underestimated how much they were coming with.
To be fair, that seems like an insane strategy.
Yeah. And I think, obviously back then, technology, as far as communications goes, they
like telegraph.
They had scouts, but they were on horseback, and they would have to ride all the way back and be like, hey, the enemy's coming, like.
How did they do combat orders mid-combat at the time? Was it like a flag system, do you know? Did they just send runners?
I think it was a combination of the two, to be honest with you. I think they used like signals and flags, and also runners, and also just good old fashioned shouting. Sometimes did the job. I mean, some of those commanders, they have good, powerful voices. They could get across the field, but
it's important to be a general.
Yeah.
and have powerful lungs. That's great.
Yeah, so the day one was pretty much a rout, and the North had to regroup and change their strategy. They also got reinforcements over the next day, and it was probably around that point where Lee was like, "Oh man, what did I get myself into?" I don't know. I think a lot of people, it might be common knowledge, but maybe I don't think people realize basically the Union had an infinite amount of soldiers to the South. By the time the Civil War ended, the Union had units of soldiers that never saw battle, just waiting in the reserve.
Wow.
But in the South, pretty much they threw everybody into the conflict.
I know this is like a numbers question, which is terrible to ask somebody, but do you know like the populations of both, the North and the South?
Not off the top of my head. I could always Google, look
That's
it up.
fair. Well, I was just curious if they, like where that disparity came from.
I would say population, as far as population density, it's definitely mainly in the North, because in the South, it was a lot of farms and fields and stuff. So the population was spread out.
Sure.
There was fewer large cities in the North. Most of the people, like you had like New York, you had Washington D.C., so you had some huge centers of Philadelphia and stuff like that.
Sure,
you had huge
like
centers of basically American culture was located in the North.
Yeah.
The South, they had like cities very early, like Atlanta, not like Atlanta we know it today. It was a far cry from the Atlanta we know. And then they also had, a few other large cities, but nothing like it was basically the North was the center of American infrastructure, American industry at the time. And that is also why the North had the advantage when it came to resources, especially munitions and all that stuff, because that was where the factories were. They were cranking out, weapons left and right. And
it seems to me, sorry to interrupt, but it seems to me like, how could the South have won that situation? Because it's sort of set up in Deadlands where Gettysburg is the turning point, and from that point on, sort of turns into a Cold War. But it sounds like the South would have just run out of resources.
So they were hoping that they could get aid from another country during their effort. They were trying to get help from France, basically.
Yeah.
France was receptive at first, but once the whole slavery thing came into view, they quickly distanced themselves from it. And I think that they were hoping that they could get, weapons and even some men from another country.
Dang.
And it didn't quite work out that way.
Was it that close with France?
I think that they wanted, an opportunity to maybe stick it to Britain and to maybe still.
Yeah.
Because, we were kind of still affiliated with Britain, even though after the revolution it was a little bit tense.
Yeah.
But I think that the South was hoping on that. Also, I think, to be honest with you, I think they were also hoping to win the war a lot sooner. I don't think they were expecting the war to last either, as long as it did. And in the very beginning, the first major battle was Bull Run. The South easily won. I mean, they took it to the North. The North was running. They were running, and so it was like, okay, we can do this. We can. I think it was almost like a lack of direction for both sides, because they would win battles and then they would be like, what should we do next? And I think it was because the motives of the war for both sides is still to this day a little murky. Like, people don't really understand the true motivations behind what drove them to fight in the first place.
Sure. Do you think how much of that is history and how much of that is disinformation? Because I felt like I went to the South recently. We went to Tennessee, we went to Georgia, and we went to a few Civil War museums. And the narrative that was presented to me in those museums was completely different than the narrative that's described up here. And it almost seems like, I don't know, I don't want to imply that the North has the perfect version of history. I wonder if it feels like both sides are trying to paint themselves in the better light than it actually was. Oh,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, for the South, obviously the slavery thing comes in. But for the South, it wasn't just about that. It was about a thing they call state rights. So basically they felt like their rights as individual states were being infringed upon by the government, by Washington, and they didn't like it. They were like, you can't tell us what to do. Like, we have individual state freedoms. And it's funny because I just made a Facebook post about this the other day, because the South lost the war. State rights was a huge thing that they were fighting for. Yet to this day, states still make their own laws. So I'm like, did the South really lose the war? Because, I don't know. I don't want to get too much into politics, but, Alabama just passed that law about abortion. Yeah. And then, Colorado decriminalizing mushrooms. So like states are still doing what they want. And with obviously the federal government has they can say, they can veto things, or they can be like, no, we're still going to police it this way. Like with marijuana, marijuana is still a class 1. Federal it is. Yeah. But even those states, which I find that to be so confusing. Like, that is really confusing. So maybe that is part of it. Like, they were saying, like, look, you can't tell us, basically. I think maybe the South.
Are you telling me the South fought for marijuana? Is that what you're telling me?
Right? No. I think the South was confused. Maybe it was a little bit confusing and frustration, because they're like saying, like, okay, we have individual state rights, but yet you guys can come in and tell us, no, never mind. You got to get rid of slavery.
Sure.
Wait,
well, to them, that issue, too, was like, that would destroy their entire economy, right?
Yeah,
and it did.
It was their economy, yep.
I mean, and you can definitely see those effects. And I think what they were proposing, now, it's still humans, and no one is going to argue that slavery should have been around longer. But, you know, from their perspective, in that time period, it had been going on for a long time, and all they wanted was a little more time. Yeah, they were going to slowly pull back the amount of slaves they had to eventually free everyone within like 25 years, right? Mm. And the North was just not willing to compromise because, it was slavery. And
I don't know. I think from my understanding, at least, is that they weren't intending on giving up slavery at all. Maybe to downsize it. Maybe to downsize it, Yeah. But I don't think they were ever gonna get rid of it. Obviously, I mean, maybe they would have in future because of technology.
Sure.
Technology would have rendered slavery.
Well, what if let's play a little game here, okay? Because we always deal in alternate history. So let's say Gettysburg happens, okay? According to Deadlands, zombies get up. These dead men rise. The Black Regiment. Both sides retreat. The South goes back to the South. Mm-hmm. They've suffered wounds. They've suffered. They're licking their wounds.
Yeah.
And then maybe to get France on their side. Like, what if they had done that? What if they had dropped? What if they said, "Hey, we're going to get rid of all of our slaves in the next X years, whatever France wants"? Like, what aid would France have been able to send them?
Huge. France at that time, and even all the way up until the end, I would say up until the end of World War I, France had one of the best militaries in the world. Dang. It would have been huge. I mean, I think the North would have been shaking in their boots. They would have been like, oh, no. Because, France was a military power. And, a lot of people don't realize that, because obviously today it's cliche, the whole thing of, the French surrendered. Yeah. And people make fun of them. But pretty much up until the end of World War I, they were considered one of the best, if not the best military in the world. So if they would have given aid to the South, it would have been a huge turning point. In fact, I don't know, because I feel like the North would have been able to get aid from Britain probably, but it would have just made the war even that much. The war would have been huge. It would have turned into maybe the First World War before the First World War.
You think they could have gotten like Britain on their side, the North?
Oh yeah. I mean, even though things were tense, if they saw France was involved, they would have more got themselves involved for that alone than to help the North.
Well, it would just sort of, I wonder if it would have sparked a world war. Because, I mean, we fight proxy wars with China and Russia all the time, where we're just delivering aid and training troops that are fighting troops that other countries trained. So, I mean, it could be a similar setup where...
Yeah. I mean, I think back then, though, the mentality was a little bit different, because they were fighting more wars of territory and taking land and taking territory.
That's true, yeah.
And so, I don't know. I feel like France, I think it could have sparked something, because I feel like other countries might have jumped in and followed France, and then other countries would have jumped in and followed Britain, and it could have been a lot bigger.
And then they would have been fighting in Europe and fighting in the U.S.
I don't know if it would have got to Europe. I mean, they probably would. Yeah. I mean, you could say that. I could definitely see that happening, but
You think everybody would just jump in on America?
yeah, and I think there would have been a lot more naval conflicts too in the sea, because obviously France and Britain at that time were huge naval powers.
Yeah.
Actually, interesting fact about the Civil War is that America emerged after that as one of the biggest naval powers after the war, because they had huge advances in seafaring technology, like like boats, and they had primitive submarines, and it was crazy. There's some crazy stuff going on there in the Civil War.
The another premise that Deadlands puts forward is there's this super coal which both sides start to use to develop incredible weapons, and it's just sort of that kind of stuff on steroids. And it's pretty interesting, man. Like that time period is just really interesting, isn't it? Like that.
It is. It's crazy, because I always, I'm blown away by how basically warfare drives technology. Like, our periods of war have been followed. Usually during war, they've developed technology that they'll use later on.
Yeah.
I always go back to World War I. When you talk about planes went from being it used to be pilots would fly side by side and shoot a rifle out the side of the out of the plane.
Sure, yeah.
So by the end of World War I, forward-facing machine guns that were timed with the propeller, so that the bullets wouldn't hit. And it's just like, whoa, what?
Yeah,
and that was in the course of only a few years that technology was pushed, but it was driven by war, and then they would eventually use the technology they'd use to develop faster planes, all that technology spills over into just regular stuff too, like things that people are using in their houses and cars, and all the engines that they use, or the technology that they use to develop engines in these planes, they would use to develop better, faster cars too. Like, it's crazy how that works. But going back to the Civil War era, it's definitely an arms race, and the South just could not keep up because they didn't have the factories that the North had.
Yeah.
And so in your guys' scenario, both sides had access to the super coal?
Yeah, both sides had access to it. There was presumably a stalemate of some kind. They had a ceasefire. And then from that point on, they just kind of fought little skirmishes, and it was basically just a Cold War between the North and the South. After talking to you, I think it makes a lot of sense if France came over, and Britain came over. Do you think that would have affected their sovereignty as nations, the North and the South, having like that much aid from those countries? What would those countries have expected, I guess?
Well, yeah, and that's the thing. They definitely would have expected something in return. These countries, they don't offer aid freely. That's the thing you learn about history, is when somebody comes begging for help, please help us, we need you.
Yeah.
They're usually like, what are you going to give us? Instead of like, oh yeah, we'll help you out of the kindness of our hearts. Nah, what are you going to give us? So they would have expected, I think with France in the South, it would have been probably just traditional things like they would have expected some trade, some agriculture, some of the fruits of the South's labor with cotton and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Because that was like a huge thing that the South produced, was cotton and, other exports.
Sure.
So yeah, it might have ended up being a raw deal. Like, that's the thing. But during war, you're desperate. You need help. Like, you're just gonna bite the bullet and then hope for the best. I think for the North, it would have been a little. See, the thing is, if Britain would have helped the North, Britain would have had to help the North, knowing that they wouldn't be able to control the North, because at that point they already lost the revolution to the North. The North was no slouch. They wouldn't have been like, all right, Britain, we'll give you all this stuff. They'd have been like, you want to fight another revolution? Because we'll fight a second one.
Were the soldiers in the North affected, or were people, let's just make it a broad category, were people in the North less affected by the war than the people in the South?
Absolutely. And that's the thing. That's the thing that made the South so mad, or drove them to make that decision to take the fight north. people in the northern cities were sitting pretty.
Yeah.
They were living fine for the most part. I mean, yeah, they lost. Obviously, their soldiers, like their dads and their sons went to this war, and a lot of them died. So I mean, I shouldn't say they were sitting pretty, but their cities were untouched. They weren't invaded. A lot of the southern cities, Fredericksburg, Vicksburg, Atlanta, for some of the other like major southern cities around that time, they were invaded and taken over, and the people had to leave. They had to flee.
Yeah,
and because these cities were being shelled heavily, so people had to pack up their things and leave their homes, leave their businesses. This was happening all throughout the war, from pretty much year one all the way to the end.
Dang.
And well, definitely in the end. The end was real rough for the South, because the North. Well, I can get into.
I mean, I don't
later,
care. Yeah, go for it, man.
Well, near the end of the war, Sherman, who was, he's the famous Northern general, Tecumseh Sherman. He
tank named after him.
Yeah, he took it to the South. He was basically ordered, hey, go and cause chaos. And that's what he did. City by city, they pillaged, they burned, they did whatever. They terrorized people. Not, it wasn't over the top, but they went in, they took a city, and they marched through. And it was the famous, they call it the March to the Sea, Sherman's March to the Sea, because he just blazed the trail through the southern cities, and people were fleeing in the wake.
And people got very upset.
Yeah. The one thing that Southerners always talk about is how the burning of Atlanta, Savannah, they talk about it almost in the same light as a war crime, basically. They thought that it was over the top. Of course, but at that time, there was no such thing. That language didn't come into play until after World War II, because obviously, they at that point, what the Nazis did, are like, okay, we gotta distinguish here what's okay for warfare, even though war is brutal. There's things that we can't do that goes way above and beyond. So when you're talking about killing civilians, when you're talking about the way you handle prisoners of war, there had to be a code. So I'm jumping way too far ahead, but that happened after World War II. So around the time of the Civil War, there wasn't any such language. And so, it was basically the honor of the general or the commander. It was like, you had to kind of rely on that. Is this an honorable guy? Should we be okay with him taking our city? Is he going to do something crazy?
What did they typically do to prisoners at that time? And was there any difference between enlisted prisoners and officers in their treatment?
So it was bad. There's a lot of stories of prisoner camps being neglected and soldiers dying in the prisoner camps. It's very similar to, I keep jumping to World War II, but it's very similar to what happened in World War II with prisoners. And it's sad. It's really sad. I think during that time, it was, if you did not want to get captured, basically.
Yeah.
And they would treat officers like differently. They would treat a commander differently than a regular soldier. But
were there any instances of like officers being traded or ransomed back to either side, or is it pretty much?
I'm not 100% sure.
That's okay.
On that.
I didn't think you'd die. It's cool. That's cool.
I know that
I'm getting real deep in my trivia here.
Yeah. No, it's not definitely out of the realm of possibility, though. I'm sure. The way they handle prisoners is usually like, hey, we captured you guys. They would just leave them in these. They had like massive prison camps. I mean, where these guys were just sitting and waiting for
the war to be over.
Dang. And a lot of guys wasted away and died. Man, it's really not a bright point in this country's history.
I suppose that's not something either side wants to talk about either.
No, because they're both guilty of it. It's funny because they like to cast blame. Like, it was the South did this. Well, you got the North, you did this. And it's always casting blame. But back to Sherman, I think he went down through Tennessee all the way. He ended up cutting through Georgia all the way. I think he went all the way down to almost Louisiana. Then they swung back around and looped up towards South Carolina. And It was basically the South knew, because they couldn't stop him. And there's nothing they can do. they were getting orders from command to hold the cities at all costs. To stop him.
Yeah.
Okay, easier said than done. Send us more men. Oh wait, there are no more men. It was bad for the South. So that was near the end of the war, late 64 into 65. So yeah, Gettysburg in 63. Let's get back to Gettysburg because there's some important things that happen when you get into day 2 of the war, because it was a 3-day battle.
Yeah.
And you get into day 2, you start getting the famous epic charges up hills to take positions that the North had held. There's Cemetery Ridge, which is one of the famous landmarks at Gettysburg.
Yeah.
And the Southern soldiers, basically, the North had the high ground.
Yeah.
And the Southern soldiers were ordered to take the high ground.
Yeah.
Against heavy fire. And it didn't end well for them, needless to say. I mean, it was a massacre, and they were ordered to take these positions, and the North had the favorable position of that it was their territory, and they knew the lay of the land a little bit better. Same thing happened to the North when they went south. There's a famous battle called the Wilderness, and in that battle, the North basically ran into this dense thicket of trees and brush.
Yeah.
And they had no idea that even existed. Well, the South knew, and they were waiting for them.
Oh,
and
man.
it was a massacre. So it's interesting, even though it's America, right? You would think, oh, well, they should know American cities, right? No, at that time, people didn't travel. I mean, it wasn't like cars and planes back then.
Yeah.
People didn't travel that much.
Yeah.
It took days to get places.
Right, and he's going to take pictures of like geographical features.
Yeah, and they didn't have the reconnaissance technology that we had later, like to take photos from the sky, which was a huge thing during later wars, during World War II. They took photographic images from above to, places, so they knew where they were going and knew what knew what fortifications existed. Well, they didn't have that. They just went in there. They went in there gun ho and was like, "Yeah, we're gonna take this territory." Wait, what is all this?
Yeah,
we can't maneuver, and the South was just like, "Yeah, this is a forest."
They were on the precipice, man. They were on the precipice of like, how long did it take from like the end of the Civil War till when we had artillery in the way that you think about it in terms of World War I, where it sort of was defined by that trench warfare and stuff.
All right, so are you talking about like machine guns and stuff that came later, or like,
I don't know, like what's the range of a cannon,
so
versus like
artillery
that they had, and
well, cannons were cannons are seen as relatively primitive, but they were pretty effective, and they had a decent range. They had bigger cannons, they had smaller cannons, they had cannons of all sizes. It's kind of funny.
Sure.
There was and they used them in a lot of different ways. The tactics are very similar though.
Oh really? Okay.
Yeah, because they would shell cities before they invaded.
Yeah.
To clear out soldiers,
people,
whatever, clear out everything. And so that tactic still remained into World War I and even World War II, is that you shell. Obviously in World War I and II, they had the advantage of having bombs from planes drop too.
Sure,
but
yeah.
Shelling was a big tactic even in Civil War, but it was mainly with cannons, and I think they had like early oh God, what's the name of the weapon?
I don't know. That's why I just said artillery.
Yeah. I should know this too. I feel like I should know this, but
howitzers are World War II, right?
Yeah, like howitzer type. But yeah, so that technology was in its early stages. Cannons were the big form of artillery, and they would use it a lot. That was another thing during Gettysburg. Cannons on hilltops, devastating. And there was a thing that they did with chains, cannonballs connected, so that
chain shot.
Yeah,
yeah.
And man, just brutal. It's just carnage.
And they did heated shot come about during the course of the war?
At the very beginning in Fort Sumter, they used heated cannonballs to basically set the fort on fire. The South did.
The little research I was doing a bunch of research about cannons, and it seemed like that was sort of the turning point of when tactics started to change for everything, was when heated shot came about, because it just made most like defensive fortifications kind of useless.
Yeah, because a lot of the fortifications were like wood based, you know. Yeah, and I forget what the technical term is. I should know, but they had a technical term for these like wood. They were basically like,
someone will tweet at us angrily.
Yeah,
it's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, they were like barriers, and yeah, so they're just made out of wood, and yeah, heated shot. Yeah, it was just eventually like there was the Civil War. I shouldn't laugh, but it's interesting to me. The Civil War had a lot of instances of fires being started in brushes and thickets and all that stuff because of the nature of the weapons. Like when the fire, the gunpowder, the sparks and stuff, it would catch like trees on fire.
Oh, wow.
And it also would catch clothing on fire, like the material that the soldiers' uniforms were made out of.
Yeah.
It was like this, you know. So
no, you shouldn't be laughing.
No, I shouldn't. The
That's
famous
brutal.
instance is I cited the Wilderness. In the Wilderness, the whole thicket ended up catching fire, and overnight, the soldiers that survived the first night, the wounded soldiers couldn't get out, and they basically burned alive. And thus, both sides had to listen to these soldiers. They couldn't do anything to help them.
Oh my God!
They had to listen to them all night, and it's just the Civil War.
Another thing about the
brutal.
Civil War is like a large percentage of troops just wouldn't fire, right? Or, you know, like I know that's a statistic I read about World War I, and I can't imagine it was any better back then.
Yeah, it was a tactic thing too, because you know they had like what do they call them, like volleys, or they had like the lines of shooters. Sure,
yeah.
And because of the nature of the weapons, it took a while for them to load and be ready to shoot again.
Yeah.
Soldiers that were in the back, you know, that some of them would never, you know, fire their rifle. You know,
they just reload.
Yeah. It's interesting because the formations and the tactics that both sides used, it was an extremely cerebral war as far as tactics went. You had a lot of commanders and generals who were a lot of them were just out of West Point, you know.
Wow. Yeah.
And so their military training, tactics, and procedures, a lot of them followed it very much by the book, and Lee was one of them for sure. But Lee was also he was by the book, but Lee also was a very much a free thinker too, and he was definitely ahead of the curve. And to be honest with you, I always tell people is if they had more resources, they would have won, because the North was doing some really stupid things in the war in the beginning. The Army of the Potomac, famously, when they ran into the wilderness, I keep citing that, but that was also a really big conflict. They didn't do their research going into that. They thought, okay, we're just going to throw all these men. We're just going to overwhelm the enemy. No problem. Whatever comes in our way. And they played right into the South's hands. The South was just like, we're just going to wait here.
Yeah.
when you guys show up, it's going to be hell. And it was like continuous mistakes by the North when it came to underestimating their opponent and also not pushing the advantage when they got an advantage.
Sure.
There was also the Battle of Antietam. So the North pushed the South back at that point. And the smart thing would have been to pursue them into the city at that point, because they had them on the run. And they didn't. The guy decided, no, we're not going after them. We'll just let them go. And
that's crazy.
Lincoln was furious. He was like, what are you doing?
Yeah,
I'm giving you all these men. I'm giving you all the soldiers. He's like, go, pursue them. And he was like, yeah, sure. Whatever, Lincoln. And Lincoln visited the camp of the commander.
Oh, my God.
At the time. And then, sorry, forgive me. His name is escaping me right now.
You're okay.
Because there's so many names, so many generals. I get some of them confused.
Do you want to look them up?
With you. Yeah. He visited the camp and told them, "Hey, what are you doing?" Basically, like, what are you doing? And he's like, "What are you talking about?"
McClellan?
Yeah. McClellan. Yeah, McClellan.
McClellan. Okay.
Yeah. So McClellan is a guy who infuriates me to no end. he basically cost the lives of a lot of soldiers because of his inaction, and also they could have ended the war 2 years sooner. And
Wow.
Lincoln was like, that's it. He ended up demoting him or taking him out of the charge of that army because he wasn't doing anything.
Wow.
They took the advantage and they didn't press it.
Yeah.
They just let the South get away.
That's when you're actually commander in chief, huh? That's pretty cool.
But Lincoln didn't really want that role. And that's the thing.
Sure.
So that brings me to actually another thing I wanted to ask you. So in this alternate world, does Lincoln ever get assassinated?
Oh, I think it's President Grant currently.
Okay.
Yeah. I think he does. I think he gets assassinated, and then I'm pretty sure he comes back. I'm pretty sure he
comes
gets
back as a zombie.
Yeah.
Zombie Lincoln. That's actually kind of dope. I like that.
Yeah, it's sort of like that.
Zombie Lincoln.
Yeah.
He's like, give me back my Oval Office. And they're like, you're dead. What are you talking about?
We've got this idea for our side show that involves Lincoln. There's a bunch of really weird shit. I'm never going to get into this, so I think it's fine that I'm spoiling it. But Grant is just like a shapeshifter, and his whole cabinet has been replaced by like these shapeshifters. So there's like a whole adventure path towards
Lizardmen.
Yeah, yeah, literally going and taking him down, and then
we're talking about Ulysses Grant, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
That poor guy, man. So I'll just real quick get into him a little bit because he's also important and an interesting figure, obviously, because he was eventually the total commander of the Union Army.
Yeah,
but he was not the first choice. He wasn't the second choice. He wasn't the third choice.
Oh my
he
God.
wasn't the fourth choice. This guy literally just kind of fell into the role, and he graduated from West Point like middle of his class.
Okay.
As opposed to Lee, who graduated top of his class from West Point.
Yeah.
So you had like two guys going at it who couldn't be more different, and also Lee was like this distinguished, like he polished his boots and he was pristine.
Yeah.
And he had respect from everyone, even on the other side. And that made Grant so mad because even Union soldiers would be like, "Oh yeah, but we're fighting Lee. We can't beat him." And Grant's like, "What are you talking about? We are beating them." And Lee just had this mystique about him. But yeah, so Grant, he served in the Spanish American War originally. And he was just a regular officer in that war. He didn't really do anything remarkable. Lee, on the other hand, made himself famous during that war. So to the point that when the Civil War broke out, he was actually the Union's first choice to lead the Union Army.
Sure, yeah.
And the only reason why he didn't was because he was from Virginia, and Virginia was a southern state.
God.
Yeah, so it had nothing to do with him believing in slavery or believing in any other, even though he did own slaves. But people say that to discredit certain people from that, like Jefferson. People's like, Jefferson had slaves. And I mean, it went a little bit deeper with Jefferson because apparently he had an affair with slaves. But yeah, but still, people use it to kind of discredit them. But at the time, that was just the thing. I'm not saying it's right, but a lot of dudes own slaves. Yeah. And to me, that doesn't mean, inherently that they were bad. It's just
sure. I mean, that's how it was, right? Like if you were, I don't know. Again, I guess I'm not going to argue for the slave.
Yeah, no.
But I get your point. I get your point that there's like, I don't know, you can't hold that against people. If you hold all historical figures to modern social values, Jesus Christ.
Yeah, we would
stand up.
Yeah, exactly. So Lee, he owned slaves, but he was also married to the niece or something of that nature. Forgive me. Of George Washington. So he was like, in basically royalty. Yeah. And the Union wanted him to lead them, and he was just like, I can't do it. I'm from Virginia. I'm a Virginian. Man. And he held that really to his core, so he led the South. And so the Union was forced to deal with dudes like McClellan and and a list of guys who just were overconfident to inept, period, at their jobs. And then Grant came in, and he was just like the every man's general. Like he was just a dude, and that was a good thing though, because he wasn't overconfident, and he knew that we have to be the aggressor because we are in a position to be the aggressor. Let's stop with the, playing cat and mouse with the South, and let's just go crush them.
Yeah.
And that was his whole thing. It was huge, and around the time of Gettysburg, that was also, I think, a huge reason why it was a turning point.
Yeah.
Because Grant came into control. And
is Lee the most fascinating figure in the Civil War?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because you know what? There's guys like Sherman, and Sherman was a real interesting guy. Real interesting. You had Sherman. You had this guy named Bedford Forrest, Nathan Bedford Forrest, who was a commander in the Southern Army. There's also Custer.
Sure, yeah.
Who was a young general at that time, who went on to the infamy, getting wiped out by Native Americans. But so there was a lot of interesting characters.
What's one thing that in your research you found incredibly interesting that isn't really talked about in like mainstream textbooks and stuff? I
guess I find it interesting just the nature of, or like the mindset. I guess they don't talk about the mindset of like the soldiers that much. I think it just gets lost. It's like, okay, is for slavery or against slavery? It was a war to end slavery. It was a war for freedom. You had Lincoln with the Gettysburg Address and all these moments, but people don't talk about the mindset of like the soldiers. And I've found a lot of stories of like soldiers who they would fight these battles, but then at the end they'd be like, they would embrace each other, Union and Southern soldiers, because at the end of the day they were countrymen, and they knew that. And for a lot of them it was tough fighting. For some of them it was tough fighting each other, because a lot of them were related to even,
right?
Which is another crazy aspect of it.
Yeah.
And so I don't think that gets talked about a lot or enough, to be honest with you. I think it should be talked about more.
Yeah.
Is that it was more than just politics in the outcome that eventually happened. There's, people, the lives that were really changed. And just a lot of incredible stories of soldiers that, just a lot of sacrifice, and there's some soldiers that actually switched sides, some took the initiative and went north and joined the Union Army.
Man, that would be crazy, wouldn't it? Like to leave your hometown and defect to the other side.
Yeah. And another crazy thing is like slaves who got freed and went to fight for the North.
Wow. Yeah.
But at that time, both sides had rules against slaves fighting in the war.
Oh, sure. Okay.
It is more understandable for the South, because it's like, why would we want the slave? But they might turn on us, turn the gun on us. But for the North, it was weird. Like, why wouldn't you use?
That is strange.
That's a huge resource for them, right?
Yeah.
You would think, because they have a real reason to fight against the South. But eventually they changed that, and there were whole regiments of, African American soldiers, and both sides actually. Near the end of the war, the weird thing is, near the end of the war, the South was desperate, so they started building units of slave soldiers, which is weird to think, right?
Christ,
but they fought for the South. Some of these, and it's weird. A lot of people. That's one thing. A lot of people don't know that.
Why would they?
Or realize that?
Why would they?
To be honest with you, I can't even comprehend what mindset would you would have to be in to do that. But I'm sure there was something. Maybe you could go to the thing, like maybe it was a thing. Like, okay, maybe something was promised to them. I don't know.
Sure.
Comfort. They had a job. I don't know. Maybe they promised them a job.
That's fascinating, though.
It is weird.
How common was that?
It wasn't common at all. It was a desperation tactic by the South, because it was when they were losing. They had no more men. Wow. So they were like, I guess we have to let these slaves fight for us. What?
That's intense.
Davis, he was the president of the South. He was like, we gotta. This is a smart idea. I don't know about this one, and they convinced him. Like, I don't know about this one. It seems so bizarre, right? That you would fight for your oppressor is really weird.
Yeah,
it would be like a Jewish people fighting for the Nazis. Like,
sure, yeah.
What? Like, what are you doing? Although that case would probably be a little bit more extreme, because the Nazis were literally killing Jews. But still,
I wonder how common knowledge that was at the time. I feel like it wasn't really common knowledge until like after the war.
No, because if you go on the social medias, when people ever have debates about the South and all this. Just any debate about the Civil War, because it can get heated.
It's kind of weird.
People will post pictures of oh, look, there's a black soldier or a black guy wearing a Southern uniform.
Yeah.
And so I saw that once and I was like, what? And I had to look into it because I didn't know, actually. And so I started doing my research that was a thing. But it was a thing.
Wow, man. I feel like there's almost no way to make the South, the Civil War, not political. Like there's no, it's kind of unavoidable at this point. It kind of sucks.
Here's the big debate, right?
Yeah.
And I would like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah,
I know you're the host. I don't want to.
Yeah. No, let's do it.
But the whole idea of removing statues of Southern generals and commanders.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
To me, I think it's wrong, to be honest with you, because look, you're talking about they're Americans, and it's weird. It's for me to say that coming from my background, being an African American. Like I feel like maybe it's not the most popular stance on that issue. But for me, after doing my research on the war, and like I said, understanding the soldiers' role in the war, it seemed to me like a crime to almost try to wipe these guys from the history books who were fighting for causes that it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't just as cut and dry as slavery for some of them.
Sure.
It was other things at play and other values at play. And they're Americans at the end of the day. And people say, oh, they were traitors. They were traitors to America. That's what a lot of people like to say. It's the counter argument.
Yeah.
So they were traitors, and we shouldn't have statues of traitors, right?
Yeah.
But it's like, it's not as simple as that, because I don't know.
So my thoughts on it are, and I learned this very recently in like the last 2 years. I just looked it up so I got my dates right, but the vast majority of those statues in the South were built between 1890 and 1950. Mm-hmm. So at that point, it seems like that's a little too late, don't you think? Like they're making statues 30 years, 40 years after the war is over.
So right, like almost like they're doing it to spite people, basically.
Well, it was during, like, that was the John Crow era too, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I mean,
the South will rise again. So we're gonna put these statues and monuments to remind you of that kind of thing.
Yes. So if
like an oppressive symbol almost.
Right. So if that's the reason, then I think I do kind of support the idea of taking him down. But I don't know. I'm white, so I don't have a huge, what's the word? I can't get too offended about anything, but I feel like...
No, you can.
I feel like...
You don't have to take your hat out or your cart. What is it?
I guess to me, it doesn't seem like it really affects anything.
Right.
I don't know if there are, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me that if I was a person of color, I feel like I walked past one of those statues, I'm not sure it would affect me.
Right.
I'd be like, oh, that's a historical figure. Cool.
To me, it should matter about it. Okay, if we want to do this, then it should matter about the individual that is being honored. So like in the instance of Robert E. Lee, a statue of him, I'm fine with.
Yeah.
I'm fine with it because for me, he wasn't this evil guy who was like, oh, slaves, we have to have slaves.
He could have been the Northern General.
Yep. He was just a guy fighting for his family, for his home.
Yeah.
And to me, that should be honored and remembered.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
But if you get into like some of the other shadier characters that could be memorialized, and okay, then fine. Yeah. Maybe not memorialize that guy because he was not the best of dudes,
That's a really good point.
And then also when it comes to the flag, the Confederate flag, that's a real hot button topic, right? Yeah. Because so a lot of people like to be like, okay, it's just a battle flag. That's what a lot of people like to say. They like to downplay it. It's just a battle flag. It just represents, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean anything about racism or anything like that, right? Yeah. And it was a symbol that was basically stolen by later like KKK and people like that used for their ideology, kind of like similar to what the Nazis did with the swastika, which originally was what was it, like an Asian symbol of like happiness or something like that?
Yeah.
Or goodwill.
I'm going to be wrong, but I feel like it's Hindu, but I could be wrong.
I think that's right around. Yeah. So, and they just took it as their symbol, and now we know it as that only.
Yeah.
So I could see that argument a little bit, but at the same time, when you think about how, like, you think about the gravity of what it represents, what it became later.
Yeah.
I feel like you have to have sensitivity to that.
Yeah.
If you can't, because look, you can say, oh, it was just a battle flag for the Southern soldiers, and we want to honor them, but then so many people were killed and persecuted under that same flag.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it became something else. And same with the swastika. Like, I'm sorry, it may
It's dead.
It may
It's
have been a
yeah.
Hindu symbol, but after what the Nazis did to it and did with it,
At some point something's just
you
claimed.
don't want a bunch of swastikas flying around. You know, that's what I try to tell those people. Like, how would you feel if there was a bunch of swastikas flying around? People were saying, "Oh, but it's just a Hindu symbol." You know?
Yeah, and it's like bullshit, dude. Yeah. Well, I feel like exactly what you're saying about the flag is absolutely true. You know, like the meaning of it has changed to where if you're a person flying that flag now, it feels like you're aware of that context.
Right.
And if you're aware of that context and you're still flying it, I don't know. We have a lot of Southerns.
It's tough.
Tweeted us, Sounds of Crows, I don't know. It's weird that it's a political and divisive issue over a flag.
And look, I get it. I get it. It's tough for some people.
Yeah.
Because they have family that fought in the Civil War.
Yeah.
But see, this is what I was trying to say. Like, I'm fine with statues and monuments of Southern soldiers.
Yeah.
But that flag, I'm not fine with. And it's because that monument to the soldiers is about the soldier,
The person.
Yeah.
And the flag,
that flag
is
has become something else, unfortunately. And it is what it is. Like, and I'm not even saying, like, as far as, I'm not saying, I should say, I'm not saying that the flag, you shouldn't, like, have it around, I guess, or just, like, be aware. I don't know. What I'm saying is flying it at the state capitol building, for instance, that they were doing in, like, South Carolina.
Yeah.
That to me is insensitive.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it just is.
Well, and too, that's a little weird as a member of the United States of America is to be flying a rebel flag.
That's another thing. I get in arguments with people about that too, because it's like, you're flying the flag of the enemy, the ones that we were fighting against, the ones that we beat under the American flag.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be like in Germany, I guess, them flying swastikas. They don't fly swastikas, even though for some German citizens, their family were just soldiers in that war.
And that was more recent history.
Yeah.
People are still alive from that era.
Yep.
Yeah.
But they know that it's the gravity of it, and they respect it. And it's.
Do you think they could get away, though, with making statues of German soldiers and generals? Because I don't think they could.
You know what? I don't know the answer to this, but do they have any monuments to German soldiers in World War II?
I don't know.
Obviously not.
But I doubt it just because of Germany's stance on it. Like, if you're not allowed
they wanted to wash their hands completely.
Yeah.
Which I can't blame them. I can't blame them at all.
Like Wolfenstein, when it's released over there, they take out everything. You know what I mean? I don't know what the word is, but they've gotten very they're very careful about their representation in the world.
See, and that's the thing, because it's so jumping to World War II, if that's all right.
Yeah.
The thing is, like, with Germany, you had regular German soldiers.
Yeah.
They called them the Wehrmacht. And then you had the Nazis. Completely different. So the Nazis, or the SS soldiers, they swore their allegiance to Hitler. The regular German soldiers didn't. They were just fighting.
They're just Germans.
For their country. Yep.
Yeah.
And so there's a distinction to be made there. And even later on, as the Allied forces invaded Europe, they made that distinction. There was no prisoners taken when it came to SS soldiers.
Sure, yeah.
And it was it was both ways. It was mutual. But with regular German soldiers, it was like, it's cool. They were like, we know, like, you're just fighting for your country, and there was a distinction that was made, And I found stories about, like, soldiers who, when their cities were overran, regular German soldiers, they were like, thank God, like, please, like, go kill Hitler, like, we hate him.
Damn. That's
But
crazy.
with SS soldiers, they were fanatical to the end.
I mean, this has all been interesting.
Yeah.
The issue is there is so much here. This is unbelievable. We could have talked about any one of those topics for like 20 hours.
Yeah,
that's
man.
crazy.
There's
man.
a lot of stuff. Just back to the Civil War, because that's what you mainly are dealing in with your thing.
Yeah.
It's just that basically after Gettysburg, it was a downfall for the South at that, and it was it for them. They had a few more victories, but after that, they couldn't muster the forces. They didn't have the resources, and eventually it led to them surrendering at Appomattox Courthouse, which that was a whole battle in and of itself. Before they went down fighting to a degree. They didn't want to surrender, but Lee at that point was just like, we're done. We have nothing left. And the surrender scenario is interesting because it was at a courthouse it was in this house, and Grant was waiting for Lee. And Grant was like wearing this old dusty uniform, muddy and stuff.
Yeah. And
Lee took time to polish his everything, and he walks in there all pristine, and he's like, "All right, let's do this. We're gonna surrender." And they sat down at a table, and he signed the papers, and he left, and people gave him an ovation. I mean, it was like it's kind of a surreal moment because both sides, like I said, they respected Lee. So that's kind of how it all ended. It was obviously it was the end, but it was also just the beginning of more tension and more things that would happen in this country as far as racial tensions, and obviously Lincoln getting assassinated. Which was huge. So, man,
I could talk about this forever. Thanks for coming on. Do you want to tell people again where they can find your stuff and where they can find you online?
Okay, so I am Wolfe X, Wolf with an E, and you can find me on Spotify and YouTube are like the main ones I use and put things on. Find me on Facebook at the Warwolf on Facebook, and then it's Warwolf X on everything else, including Twitter. Which Twitter and Facebook are probably my two main places where I interact with people, and then Spotify is probably the main place to find my music. But you can find it on other streaming platforms as well. I am in the process of working on another project, another album, which will be about I'm doing one about Lord of the Rings, and then I'm also I'm also doing one I call Chronicles of the World, which the one I'm working on will be Volume 3, which is a collection of various stories from history. I encourage anyone, if you do end up looking me up, give me ideas of stories to write songs about, because I will definitely make it happen. So
cool, man. Hey, well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. All this stuff will be in the show notes. If you guys want to give his stuff a listen, please do. I think there's the amount of people rapping about history has got to be less than a dozen.
I
like
to claim
one.
that I'm the only one, to be honest with you. Doing it the way I do, as comprehensive as I do, I would say I'm the only one.
I absolutely believe that.
Yeah, I think so.
I absolutely believe that. Well, to everybody else, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next Monday. I had such a great time with this one, folks. Thanks again to Werewolf X for coming on. You know, most of the time when I do these firesides, I send the people coming on a list of questions beforehand I want to hit. You know, with this guy, I didn't send him anything. He showed up, asked him whatever I wanted, and he extracted that knowledge out of his mind like a goddamn professional. I'd love to have him back on. I cut about 30 minutes from this episode of a conversation we had about World War II in the middle of this conversation about the Civil War, so I'll be posting that at some point. Thanks again. Go listen to his music. And while we won't see you with crows next Monday, Harrison and Cooper will be there waiting in your feeds when you wake up Monday morning. I'd love your feedback on this episode and on Harrison and Cooper versus New York. Bye-bye.